Hello and welcome to another episode of Kanopy Conversations, where we sit down with the brilliant minds behind the films that move, challenge, and inspire us. I'm Christian Pierce, and today I'm honored to be joined by filmmaker Sav Rodgers, whose documentary Chasing Amy from 2023 is a deeply personal exploration of identity, storytelling, and the complicated legacy of a cult classic. Sav, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I feel like I say this to everybody I meet, but I'm a true believer in Canopy. I think it is a genuine force for good in the world, so I can't tell you how stoked I am to talk to you today.
I'm glad to see that you're a Canopy evangelist. So,
I 100% am. I think that educational distribution is one of the most important tenets that filmmakers need to know about, and I am a firm believer in accessibility of our stories. I just my life was changed because my mom had a DVD at home that I just happened to watch. And in an age where everything is kind of curated for you, I think Canopy is a platform that encourages curiosity about how other people live, which is not just good for storytelling, but is good for people. And so I think Canopy, as a distribution arm for the digital part of making films available through educational means like libraries and schools, it opens a portal to other worlds for people who are interested in learning how other people live, and how they tell their stories.
as an educational platform, Canopy is available to many university students. Knowing they may wish to one day enter the film industry, can you tell us how you got your start and what inspired you to pursue this path? Given the obsession with chasing Amy and your love of film, I'm hoping that's part of your story, but I'd love to hear directly from you.
Absolutely. I think you see my genesis throughout chasing Amy. I was just a guy who wanted to make movies. I was making, short films at the time, student short films specifically, short films of their own discipline, that I think are to be respected and not just, relegated to like, well, that's what you make if you can't make a long movie. It's what you use as a proving ground. Yes, and, short films are their own discipline. For me, feature films were always the dream, and so Chasing Amy was a massive part of that. It was the first film that I saw that made me feel like I could be a part of it. Kevin Smith tells a similar origin story with, going to see Slacker at the Angelica, and him thinking, okay, this is a movie that feels like, I could have been a part of something like that. And so Chasing Amy was the first thing to really capture my imagination in a way where it felt like I could be part of the creation process. At the time I was a kid that wrote a lot of stories. I was lonely. I had a big imagination, and cinema and television like were my portals to another universe, and perhaps a universe that I would have preferred to live in. And so when I saw Chasing Amy, it not only affected me in terms of identity, but it also helped me find my purpose and really set me on a path to wanting to become a filmmaker. And so through my passion for cinema, I not only did I find my purpose, but I also found, my first feature subject, which was, finding out what this film meant to other people and all of its nuances, but also accidentally, in a lot of ways, telling my own coming of age story against the backdrop of Chasing Amy and exploring what cinema means to us, what stories mean to us, and the impact they can have on our lives. So, the practical version of that is I saw Chasing Amy. It made me want to become a filmmaker. I had big dreams, but my parents were like, you need to go to college, before you try to move out to California. I had the audacity to be like, I'm going to move to San Diego because I know people there and that's pretty close to LA, relatively speaking. I didn't have a driver's license. I had no plan. And at the University of Kansas Film School, film department, it was where I learned how to cut my teeth as an independent filmmaker. I found mentors, I found collaborators. I met Bradley Garrison, who is one of the, DPs of Chasing Amy. He was the first person I pitched the idea to, and is my best friend. And so, there I found community, I found a path forward, and I also learned that as an independent filmmaker, you have to be resourceful. You know, the University of Kansas is not a well-funded film department compared to a lot of institutions around the country. But what you learn there is how to make do with the resources you have, and you have educators that are so invested in the success of what you do, and you have alumni who are willing to give you a helping hand as you enter the business, so to speak. So that's where I got started. But everybody's path is going to be different. You know, I entered production in college, and but the big thing that I learned from Matt Jacobson, who was one of my professors at KU, and also you know, shot a few days on this, was directors direct. And so, regardless of what you're doing, what rooms you're entering into, you have to be generating new work and you have to be learning how to do that job if you reasonably expect people to, you know, see you as a director. And I've never forgotten that.
I've asked this question of every filmmaker I've interviewed, and I never get the same answer. There are some common threads, you know, a passion for film, a single film that might have inspired, you know, leaping into this as a career, and then film school. You know, being a film school student myself at one point, and then a professor at another. Uh, I know the power of that environment and the community that you've discussed, because those are friendships, relationships, professional, you know, ties that you will carry with you throughout your career, and really enable you to get your start. I will say I will never ever show my student films to anyone except my kids. But it was a great proving ground. For me, it was a proving ground that I don't need to be in production. I need to be somewhere behind or in marketing or in film history. But great to hear your path, and the result. I've seen the result. It's an amazing film, and I want to dig into some of that a little bit further. So Chasing Amy is so layered. It's about you, about Kevin Smith's Chasing Amy, and also about the broader LGBTQ plus experience. What initially made you want to tell this story specifically?
Well, you know, going back to being at KU, I would tell people that Chasing Amy was my favorite movie. And, you know, the memory that's like burned into my brain is that I had a professor who, you know, basically was kind of giving me shit a little bit. Sorry if I can't swear. But kind of giving me shit a little bit for Chasing Amy being my favorite movie. It was met with like a lot of skepticism, you know, and we were both queer people, and I was like, huh, that's interesting. And you know, I started to explore conversations from there. Um, that what I learned was that there was a major dissonance between how I saw Chasing Amy and what it meant to me as a kid versus how it affected a lot of other queer people. And, you know, it's a complex legacy. And there's a lot of nuance behind the film. You know, I meet queer women every week still who have their own specific relationships to Chasing Amy. But the biggest thing was that I never met a person who was just like ambivalent about the movie, which I think is the mark of an interesting film, is that somebody has a strong opinion one way or another. They think it's the greatest thing in the world, or they think it's the worst thing in the world. There were very few people that were just like, meh, whatever. Chasing Amy, forgettable. Like the people who had seen it, they had a strong point of view on it, and certainly I did. And I was like, I think there's a story in here. I just don't know what it is yet. And so, you know, before we premiered it, Tribeca, I was like going through my old notebooks, trying to figure out like when was the first time that I came up with an idea for a documentary on Chasing Amy. And it was in 2015, you know, the first year that I really started like showing my films at film festivals and like pursuing stories with like conviction. And the idea just evolved from there and became something throughout the process, as all documentary filmmaking typically is, you know, that where the process just evolves and the story changed. So it was an anthropological examination almost at first, and it became this decisively personal story that, you know, captures a lot of queer cinema history, what it means to love film and cinema, and what stories mean to us, all within my coming of age story against the backdrop of Chasing Amy and trying to honor the stories of the people who made Chasing Amy, as conflicting as their truths can be at times.
Let's talk about that evolution a little bit further, specifically your evolution. So, in the film, we see your relationship to Chasing Amy evolve as you learn more about its history and its impact. What was the most surprising or challenging realizations you had during that process? Because there are actually a couple of times during the film where you cut, you stop, and as a viewer, you can tell, okay, Sav's processing something here. Maybe we'll learn about it a little bit further as the film progresses, but something happened in that moment. And it's clearly changing the way that you see the film, the filmmakers, the talent, and your story. Your story evolves throughout this, throughout this journey. So, would love to hear whether there were surprises or challenges and the things that you kind of had to cope with during the course of this production.
Uh, an unofficial log line for Chasing Amy could be director Sav Rodgers deals with a series of surprises trying to make a documentary about Chasing Amy. Yeah, I mean, everything that I didn't know going in uh, was astounding in retrospect, but that's part of the process. You're making your first feature, you're telling the most personal story that you'll ever tell, in my instance. Um, so yeah, there was certainly a lot of moments of growth that you see on screen. Uh, I'll get a lot of people who've seen the movie who ask me questions about it, or emerging filmmakers who ask me about the process of making something so personal. Um, and I just tell them, like, you have to surrender to everything that you don't know. And so what you see on screen, the interviews with Guinevere Turner and Joey Lauren Adams, there were certainly a lot of revelations in the, got 10 plus hours that I interviewed Kevin over the course of this documentary. And when you are building rapport with documentary participants and they are being so vulnerable with you, you have to reflect on, you know, what you are also contributing in terms of like building that vulnerability and trying to hold that space for both of you to have those conversations. And I think one of the things that informed that and helped build trust quickly with participants is that I gave a TED talk about what Chasing Amy meant to me as a 12-year-old and how it saved my life. And so we were already starting from the premise that the work that I was interviewing them about meant something to me, but I was also open to hearing any truths that I didn't know. And boy, howdy, did I learn a lot of things that I didn't know. When you go into a documentary, you are looking at the archives that are available to you, but those archives are populated by information from the perspectives of whoever is doing all the talking. And so what you are seeing in that instance for Chasing Amy, you're seeing PR, you're seeing press, you're seeing Kevin talk about things from his perspective. But what it's not populated by are stories from Guinevere Turner. It's not populated by stories from Joey Lauren Adams outside of a PR context. It's not populated, aside from the op-eds that came out after the internet boom, prior, uh, to I'm going to pull a year out of the back of my head here, but prior to the 2010s or the late aughts, you're not seeing a ton of think pieces readily available assessing the legacy of Chasing Amy as a queer film. And so all of these things contribute to the context to which I'm entering into as somebody who's like studied Chasing Amy for 15 years, where I am completely taken by surprise by the vulnerability and the honesty of our documentary participants, namely Guinevere, Kevin, and Joey. So you can see all over my face all of the things that I am learning in real time. And that's part of it. Every scene in Chasing Amy has to contribute and build up to my evolving relationship with Chasing Amy over time as I'm going through this documentary process. So yeah, I could fill a whole other book still with the stories of what I learned on this film.
The interviews are some of the most intense, aspects of the film. And as I said, there are a couple of times during those interviews where you have to take a moment, have to pause. Uh, Can you talk about the preparation for those interviews? You show and you just mentioned this about the PR footage that you got around the film. There's a lot of like the MTV News type interviews or Access Hollywood types of things where they, on a red carpet shove a microphone in your face and, tell us about your film and, your experience on this production. Uh and you get a lot of surface, but you don't get anything beyond that. Can you give us a sense? Because you get arguably the most candid conversations I think any of these participants have had with respect to this title, with respect to Chasing Amy. So, can you give us a sense of your preparation? We have a lot of documentaries on Kanopy, and this is a topic I've brought up with a few other documentarians about that preparation because so much has to happen in pre-production and you roll the camera and that's it, that's your footage. You're not going to do a lot of retakes around a question that you're asking. So would love to hear how you prep for this.
Sure. I mean, again, it was 15 years of research to some degree for me. So I would do things like, read John Pearson's landmark book, Spike, Mike, Slackers, and Dykes. I read, anything that was remotely tangential to this period of like independent cinema, the new queer cinema movement, anything I could get my hands on to prepare, listening to, podcast interviews, listening to interviews that the participants had previously done. What had they said on the record? Looking through, Q&As that they had done for the movie over the previous 20 years. What had they already said? And including looking at like the Blu-ray features for Chasing Amy, which includes this, amazing behind the scenes documentary that's like a retrospective 10 years after Chasing Amy called Tracing Amy, which like we didn't want to be a behind the scenes documentary. We wanted to, you know, uh, find new information and bring that to the table. And so none of the questions that I had prepared were really like, well, tell me about, you know, tell me about, your favorite day on set necessarily. It wasn't, like a retrospective where, everybody got to pat themselves on the back. It was like, hey, this movie means a lot of different things to different people as a queer person. I love this movie, but I'm holding all this, space for people to be able to share their real feelings. And we tried to align with all of our participants up front about that. So how I approached, the interviews with participants in Chasing Amy, whether they were behind the scenes or in front of the camera, was very different than how I talked to cultural critics, right? For cultural critics, I wanted them to be able to articulate, their feelings as people who were kind of setting the tone for how Chasing Amy was discussed in public if you were not part of the production, versus, hey, people's real lives are wrapped up in this movie, actually. It's one thing to, leave a pithy review on Letterboxd being like, this movie sucks. It's another thing to dedicate years of your life to it and that movie being wrapped up in your legacy. And so I wanted to make sure that we were being respectful anytime that we were in a space, and that we were talking about these things with care, even if we were asking difficult questions. And so yeah, so that was the prep that I did, but what you see when you're watching the movie is a lot of those questions are immediately thrown out the window. I'm not sitting there necessarily with a list of questions like in my lap, you know. I have questions that I've prepared, I've memorized a lot of them, but it's really about going with the flow of conversation and what your participant is wanting to talk about to some degree, and getting the questions you need answered. So in Kevin's case, it was extremely thorough. The first interview I did with him, I sat in his house for like, I mean, we were in his house for a long time, but I think it was like 6 to 7 hours of footage of just him talking and us talking. And so, which was extremely generous of him to allow us to be in his home for that long, talking to him about this and not giving him like softball questions. We talk about Harvey Weinstein. We talk about really challenging aspects to the film. We talk about his relationship with Joey, which is something that he obviously cares a lot about, as you would with, any significant relationship that you've had. And, you know, utilizing that for such a personal film. With the Guinevere and Joey interviews, my questions were almost immediately thrown out the window because they were interested in having a different conversation. And so in those moments, you just have to listen and respond and kind of go with the flow of conversation. And for specifically for the Joey interview, I had surrendered that any of my questions that I prepared were immediately irrelevant because there was a person in front of me telling me her real truth, her real story. And the only thing that you can try to do in that moment is to honor it and to make sure that when you get to the edit, that you are representing that conversation in full, despite the fact that it went on for a couple of hours, not 10 minutes. But the 8 to 10 minutes that we have in the movie, we really try to emphasize that Joey's truth is important. And we built the movie around building up to that moment and what happens after that moment.
Yeah, the interview with Joey Lauren Adams is the most intense in the film. And I was going to ask you, that was my next question, specifically was that interview, and you position it last because I that interview surfaces some details and aspects of filmmaking in the late 90s, especially as a female protagonist and actress on set, and things that we now know in hindsight, but again, were not public at the time. So she shares a lot of details, and you can tell in that moment that those were things you weren't expecting. But to your point, that's her experience. That's authentic, and it clearly had an impact on her both personally and professionally. So there are some brutal revelations in that moment, and it's an intense interview. And again, it's part of the power of your film. You kind of approach it with, initially an obsession and a love for chasing Amy, the film, but the journey you end up taking through the course of these interviews, you learn so much more about not only the impact on yourself, but the impact across the board. Whether it's, professors who have studied the film and have written about the title, or those that were on set behind the camera, and the impact that it had both on their career, and going forward, the success that the film had, and then ultimately its impact and varying career paths for several folks. So I thank you for those interviews because they brought forth. Kevin gives a lot of interviews, Joey does not. So to hear her speak about her experience with this film, I think was is one of the most valuable aspects of your title. And as someone, I was in college in the 90s when this film came out. I was in a gender studies program. So we talked about this film when it came out. It was fascinating to see and learn the depth behind the film. I hadn't really thought about all these other components, and they come to the forefront in that Joey interview. So again, applaud you and your preparation and your ability to just throw your notes out and go, let's see where this interview takes us, because it's not what I had prepared, but this is what they want to speak to, and this is what they experienced.
Well, and thank you for saying that. And that moment really speaks to the fact that like these are real people. And I really want audiences to start considering that more as they are watching documentaries. I think the documentary boom of the 2010s was good for some things and really bad for other things. And one of the things that I think has impacted the world negatively is the idea that people's real lives and stories can be commodified just for pure entertainment. And I never forgot for a second that I was talking to a person that I admired my whole life from afar. Um, People whose work allowed me to be there sitting in that chair talking to them. And, there's a journalist one time who like asked me, like, do you feel like you got like a scoop? And I was like, no. I felt fucking awful sitting there thinking about the pain that these people experienced to some degree, you know, whether it was Joey or Guinevere or Kevin, that there was a lot of pain and hurt wrapped up in something that, has brought joy or distress to millions of people at this point, chasing Amy. But it's the same, it can be said of any film.
You're right. There are documentaries where you feel like they're exploiting the subject a little bit further. And obviously, with a reality TV boom, that level of exploitation can be, exponential. And that's not documentary, right? That's a
Right.
different genre completely.
and unscripted, where it's
Yep.
like you don't write the script, you're allowing your participants to participate in that process, but it's not always a great process. I was in the driver's seat of Chasing Amy the entire time as the director. And I was like, I wasn't planning on telling my story in the movie until everybody around me was like, Sav, the movie's about you.
Yeah.
When you
Yeah.
build a team of really smart people, you know, you have to listen to them to some degree. And if you get the same note more than 3 times, let alone 200 times, you should really listen to it.
And I want to talk about you as a subject because you're such a again, you're not only the director, but you're also one of the key components of the film.
Yeah.
This project spans years of your life and includes moments of real vulnerability. How did you navigate being both the director and, in many ways, the subject of the documentary?
You would probably have to ask the producers and Bradley Garrison, who I mentioned earlier, and the people who were with me on that over the course of 7 years, like how they thought I handled it. I felt like I was going crazy for during post production. Thank goodness for Sharika, our editor, and Lauren, our AE, and our producers who helped me see the forest from the trees throughout that process. Because at the outset of the project, I wasn't planning on being in it at all. And then people were like, hey, your story is the reason that we're signing up for this. You should really consider being in it. And so my comp was Bing Liu's participation in Minding the Gap, which is his beautiful film that was nominated for an Academy Award. That's, like the best meditation on contemporary American masculinity that I've ever seen. And it is a reference that I held dear throughout the process of making Chasing Amy. But by the time that, we got to post production, I didn't realize the whole movie was about me. Like I didn't realize that yet. And so I had asked for a cut where it was my initial vision and that we were sticking to it, where it was more detached and anthropological. And that movie wasn't good. It wasn't nearly as interesting. And so I had to surrender to the fact that the story had become something else. And if I wanted to make the best version of the movie as a filmmaker, I had to acknowledge my discomfort as a human being who is fairly private. Um, and, I would say somewhat emotionally guarded. And so, how do I talk about these things that were really challenging in my life? The TED Talk was one thing, that was 8 minutes, but 92 minutes of a film, that was another uh, thing. And so, thank goodness for Riley, and thank goodness for our producers, because once we locked picture, once we were done with the edits and I was approving color and sound and all those things, the other producers were like, "Hey, we got this. Go take a break." Because it was at that point 4 years of my life and a really intense year in post-production to get the story just right. And so I had to learn how to take care of myself outside of being a filmmaker, which so much of my identity was wrapped up in and still is. But, Riley is always really great at helping introduce fun into my life. So I spent more time with my family leading up to Tribeca because I knew the next, 2 years were going to be really intense, like trying to get our story out there. Um, and while nothing is perfect, in terms of my work-life balance, like I really had to learn to take care of myself because I was having panic attacks because leading up to our premiere, because and I told the other producers this. I was like, any of you can walk away from this, and even if the movie is received terribly, and you can go make another movie. I don't know if my career will be over before it really starts if this doesn't work, but also like I'm putting myself out there in a way that is really vulnerable, where I'm opening myself up to critique, judgment, not just as an artist, but as a human being whose story this is, you know? And so it would sting when we would get like a half-star review on Letterboxd being like, it seems like this guy just wanted to make a movie about himself. And I'm like, oh, if you only knew the truth. And but I was so thankful that the movie's been so well received by audiences and critics alike. Like I just couldn't believe it. It was really like breaking my brain. So yeah, like being a documentary participant, it's hard, it's vulnerable. Being telling a personal story, it's hard, it's vulnerable. And I'm so grateful that I've gone through this process because and maybe I'll have to eat my hat later about this, but I don't think another movie will ever be this personal for me again. And I'm very thankful that I had the lessons I had on this movie at the outset of my feature filmmaking career versus, you know, versus the latter.
Yeah, it's a hell of a place to start your feature film journey, putting yourself so far out there, and for the audience to see, critique, receive, all of that plays out. And I appreciate you saying that. I'll be honest, I hadn't quite thought about how vulnerable you were as an individual leading up to a release. Because again, you've shown it to your friends, your family, and they're all going to give you praise and positive thoughts. But it's not until you get it in front of the public that you really understand how the project's going to be received and how you're going to be received. So, uh, I appreciate you telling us how that led to some anxiety, a lot of anxiety, evidently, and because again,
Oh
it's
yeah.
it's more than just the story of chasing Amy. It's the story of you and chasing Amy and your journey, your personal and professional relationships.
Well, I mean, like two things here. One, imagine okay, so imagine that you, and I want people to think about this the next time they watch the movie or whatever. Imagine you think that the world sees you the way that you see yourself, right? So for me, the way that I am now, right? I thought this to some degree that this is how I looked and was perceived by people the entire time that we were making this movie. And then you get the footage back and you're transitioning. And you weren't planning on it, and you certainly weren't planning on doing it in public to any degree. And so you got to watch that over and over again when you are like going through the process of effectively having like a second puberty, right? So your emotions are already high. And so like very quiet, like I was having a hard time with that, let alone the process of watching yourself come of age, right? We all love coming of age films. It's wonderful to see the process of somebody becoming. It's a lot less fun when you're watching yourself do it. But like the movie demands that you are honest. Not just that it's a documentary, but audiences are smart. They can see bullshit from a mile away. Um, and so I was extremely hard on myself, thinking about myself as a protagonist, where it's like, okay, am I a likable person? Would people give a shit about seeing me for, this 92 minutes? And so it's also weird to negotiate that with yourself when like you don't want to be on camera in that way. I love talking about the work. I love opportunities like this. I love Q&As, I love getting to talk about the work. Don't love talking about the hardest things that I dealt with in my life at that point, in front of a bunch of people that I hadn't really processed myself yet, let alone wanted to open up like scrutiny for public conversation. And so that's the context in which I made Chasing Amy of like, well, fuck. Like now it's just all out there, and I have to deal with this in real time. And there's money on the line. We have commitments we've made to people. We got to get this movie out there. It's wrapped up in business all of a sudden. And so when people are like, should I make a personal documentary? I'm like, you should know all the facts about making a personal documentary before you make one. It's not that it can't be wonderful, and maybe you won't have the existential dread that I did about it. But if you do, you should know what you are doing and that there is a personal cost there. And I am discernibly not the same person that I was when I started this process. And I like this person, but I also miss that kid who thought everything was going to be fine. Through this process, like I've gone through, I have a completely different worldview to some degree. I have a different belief system to some degree. And that's the cost personally of making a personal documentary. And I'm not complaining. This film has opened so many doors and I'm so proud that we made it. But you have to know that you will be different if you are self-aware to any degree.
Sav, I appreciate all the time today, and the thoughtful responses you've given me to all of the questions. I know that this film was a tough one to make, and you expose yourself in a way that I think most filmmakers certainly don't do, because most filmmakers are happy to be behind the camera but not in front of it. And more so you're a documentary subject, and again, you're the one making the decisions on what to tell and what not to tell, and you reveal yourself in a way that I think our audiences will certainly appreciate now, and as they look back on Chasing Amy and the impact of film in general. It may not be that Chasing Amy speaks to you; it may be another title. But I think what you see in Sav's film and in his journey is really the power of cinema, the power of storytelling, and just being who you are in that moment, and letting others see it. I think that's the most important part, and I think that's what we at Canopy are so excited about, is that your title is here for people to see, and we want to make sure that that gets as as widely circulated as we can make it.
Well, thank you, Christian. I mean, so thrilled that Chasing Amy is on Canopy. Literally, one of my goals with distribution was to be on here. I also just want to say, like I don't feel any sense of like martyrdom about like, being on camera. It was like not part of the plan, but I'm very happy that this movie now belongs to other people. I get so many messages a week now from people that are like, I saw myself in your story and we share virtually no life experience. There are always people who have felt alone or discounted. There are people who love cinema. There are people who have loved a story that has changed their lives. And like the 92 minutes that you spend in Chasing Amy, I think that a lot of people can get something out of it because you're just walking in somebody else's shoes for a minute, even if you're not trans, even if you're not queer, even if you're not from the Midwest, maybe if you've never wanted to be in the film business, whatever, it doesn't matter because it's a deeply human story about wanting to find who you are to some degree. And Chasing Amy um was a great conduit for that in my life. And I'm excited to continue to see how people respond to this movie. Especially being able to watch it for free on Canopy with a library card. That's literally all my dreams coming true right there.
Can I close with one last question? Because have
Of
you
course.
had the moment that you had with Kevin Smith? Have you had somebody come to you saying, "I just saw Chasing Amy, and it impacted me in a way. It saved my life. It made me realize I'm not alone in the world." Have you had that moment?
I'm getting emotional because yes, I get really nice emails. I get really nice responses when we do Q&As. I get really the purpose of the movie was to make a movie that was important to me and that I could stand behind 100%, and some to some degree, the target audience was me and Kevin, the two people who arguably, publicly give a shit about Chasing Amy in a way to make it part of our professional careers. Kevin because that's his movie, that's his baby, and for me because I've talked about it at length for for my career and for my life. um the responses that we've received from this movie have blown me away. It's I knew in the back of my head that if we did it well, that would be the result. Nobody's been like, this stopped me from killing myself or anything like that, and that's not the again, that's not the purpose. Um but trans kids seeing the movie, parents of trans kids seeing the movie and seeing what it looks like for a child to be supported and to be able to grow up and have a future, for all of his dreams to come true because his mother loved him, to see a trans guy be loved and it not be exceptional to still be loved after you transition, for things to work out. Um, in some ways, these are radical still in storytelling about trans people, to have a story about a trans guy that's not linked to a medical transition, but it's the process of becoming yourself, the way that everybody has to learn how to become themselves. And who's the person that you actually want to become? Um, to see a person's dreams come true, you know, and to know that you can have a future. That that shit matters. Even if it wasn't me in the movie, that shit matters to people to know that you can have a future. And so, I'm excited to see how that continues to evolve. But I mean, there are people who have just left me in tears during Q&As. They're like crying on my shoulder. I always ask, do you want a hug? Because the process of I think watching this movie is you see yourself in me to some degree. It's not about me. It's about, and we do this with all protagonists in cinema. We're going through the process and we're kind of quietly evaluating, like, God, what if I was in this scenario? God, what if this happened to me? Or God, like I relate to this. I understand this, you know? Um, and it's been really beautiful. And it has changed my life in the way that I interact with people, knowing that like, okay, like this was, you know, I think the filmmaking process you have to find the process to be rewarding in and of itself, or else you're doing it for the wrong reasons. Like you have to love the filmmaking process, I think. But this is a really nice bonus to know that the work resonates with people. That shit'll keep you going on a day where you're like really doubting yourself and like doubting like am I even supposed to be here? Should I even do this? Is it worth it to go through the heartbreak of like trying to put another project together for it to fall apart? You know what I mean? Like that fucking means something and it can carry people forward. And so, hey, I think I'm an example of this. If you love a movie, tell the people who made the movie you loved it. Like it opened up a whole world of possibilities for me in this process, but it keeps artists going, especially in the current context where everything is hard. You can be Meryl Streep and you still don't get a project off the ground. So that's the context. So yeah, that shit continues to change my life.
Thank you for that. At Canopy, we like to say that cinema can feed your soul. And I'm getting emotional just talking about it. To hear that you've had those moments, I think is important. To your point, telling a filmmaker, telling a storyteller that what you saw, what you read, what you witnessed changed you in some way, I think is it not only important feedback, but it's part of what makes us a community. It's part of what makes us people. Uh, wow. Uh, Sav, thank you.
Thank you, Christian.
I
I'm
did
glad I'm
not
not the only
expect
one.
this interview to go like this today, but wow. Uh,
Yeah, and for context for anybody watching this, we started recording this at 10 a.m. in the morning. You still have a whole workday after you, Christian.
yeah, I do. I do. And again, thank you so much. Your film is incredibly powerful. Uh, I'm gonna just close with just some summaries for our viewers to let them know that this is available and they need to see it. So, for our viewers, Chasing Amy is available now through participating libraries and universities on Kanopy. And as an added bonus, public library viewers in the United States can also see Kevin Smith's original Chasing Amy through the remainder of the year. You can watch both today at canopy.com. Just note that access may vary by country and library. Uh, Thanks for joining us for this episode. Until next time, I'm Christian Pierce. Don't forget to. Oh, Sav, I'm telling you, man, incredible interview today. Don't forget to join us for more Canopy Conversations as we continue to speak with the minds behind the movies. And as you can see, it's been an impactful one today. Thank you for watching. Sav, thank you so much.
Thank you.